We are good to go, Debbie. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, and I will share my screen as well, if that make sure that this
I
works.
checked, so that should be fine.
Okay, can you see my screen? Did that do what it was supposed to do?
Yes, I see your screen.
Okay, fantastic. Hi, everyone. As mentioned, I'm Debbie Davis. I'm the Chief Audit Executive for the Utah State Board of Education. I've been in this position for about 12 years now. It has been just an invigorating and exciting opportunity to be in public education during this time. Before that, I was with the Office of the State Auditor in the state of Utah. So I just kind of bounced around to a lot of different programs and agencies in the state. I've been able to see a lot and experience a lot. So I was really appreciative of the opportunity to come speak to this group. It's been a while since internal audits had this opportunity. So we appreciated the invite and we were asked if we could speak a little bit about fraud, right? Something that we're seeing in the papers, in the news, it's coming up. And I did take a little bit of liberty with this and decided to include as well waste, abuse, and fraud. Those are kind of a trifecta, especially in government in this space, right? Something that we talk about and maybe even more important in government than it is in a commercial or a private space. So I do have this information document that I put together. I've made it available to Lisa. She may have sent it out to all of you or will make it available with the recording. Regardless, it's out there for you, but we're going to talk through it. I'll provide some additional information as well. You're welcome to put questions or responses to answers or questions in the chat. And if there's anything you want to say, you are welcome to raise your hand and make a comment or ask a question. All right, so diving in, waste, abuse, and fraud. As I did some research on this, I was pleasantly surprised that the Government Accountability Office, and this is at the federal level, they've recently published some anti-fraud resources, and it's quite extensive. You'll see in the information document, I included the link there so that you can go and peruse all the different resources and materials that they have. I did include some of them here. We'll talk through some of them. But on one of their overview pages, it includes this question, why should you care about fraud? And of course, I would ask, why should you care about waste, abuse, and fraud? But as we look at the paragraph under that question, they say, when fraud occurs within or against federal agencies and programs, and anytime you see federal, you're welcome to just insert state and local as well. So when fraud occurs within or against federal agencies and programs, it wastes taxpayer dollars, harms the overall integrity of federal programs and services. It can erode public trust and may result in other negative impacts in areas such as public health and safety and national security. And we're education, so I'm adding education to the list that they put together. Um, a couple of words popped out as I was reading through that, and that is integrity and trust. Those are two very critical words. And maybe it wasn't even those words so much as the words that we're just in front of public trust and integrity, but it's that they can be harmed, that we can erode integrity. And it's so important in the government space. And I think government has taken some flack, right? We all get stigmatized if something goes wrong anywhere. We're all under this government umbrella. So it's really important that we're all on the same page. We're all doing as much as we can to maintain public trust, to ensure there is integrity in the work that we do. All right. I also wanted to establish some definitions so that we're consistent in the terminology that we're using when we talk about waste, abuse, and fraud. These definitions are coming from Standards for Internal Control in the federal government. This is also known as the Green Book. Hopefully, this is not a new book that you're hearing about, but that it's sort of familiar. Maybe you've given it a read. It was recently updated. And I recommend it. I make all my staff read it. It has a lot of good concepts in it, but it also has definitions for waste, abuse, and fraud. So let's go over those quickly again so that everyone's on the same page, we're using consistent terminology. So it says waste is the act of using or expending resources carelessly, extravagantly, or to no purpose. One thing that I thought interesting in this definition is that it says it's waste is the act. It's an act. So think about that as we go to now the definition of abuse. So it says abuse involves behavior that is deficient or improper when compared with behavior that a prudent person would consider reasonable and necessary operational practice given the facts and circumstances. Abuse may include corruption through the misuse of authority or position for personal gain or for the benefit of another. So remember how waste, it says waste is the act. It's interesting that it says abuse involves behavior. So that just got me thinking, okay, is abuse just the stackable acts of waste, right? That it's like, oh, we just, if you're wasting things, resources to a certain extent, all of a sudden does an act become a behavior? I don't know. I'm just speculating, but maybe, possibly. But it is interesting to see like how do these three terms kind of work together. So the third term being fraud, right? It says fraud involves obtaining something of value through willful misrepresentation. That's a pretty short and sweet definition. But you might notice for misrepresentation, there's a footnote, and you can see the footnote is a little bit loaded. So let's look at that footnote. Again, fraud, obtaining something of value through willful misrepresentation, which could be that there's material false statements of fact, right? It could be omission or concealment of material fact. And material is a very important word here, right? Material. What is material to your LEA? What is material to the public education system, to the state of Utah? Materiality is a very important concept with fraud. It says willful misrepresentation may involve actual knowledge, deliberate ignorance, which is being aware of a substantial risk of misrepresentation, but intentionally avoiding steps to confirm truth or falsity, or reckless disregard. So, and that's to be conscious of a substantial or unjustifiable risk of falsity, but make the representations anyway. So this is pretty comprehensive as we're looking at it. I appreciate the last statement, though. I think it's another critical piece that management needs to be aware of. Both it's really good for management, and I guess I'll read it first and then I'll talk about why it's so great for management, and then also put this on notice. So it says a judicial or other adjudicative system determines whether an act is in fact fraud. This determination is beyond management's professional responsibility for assessing risk. So right out the chute there, it says, hey, there needs to be this legal process that ends up in some kind of judicial, a hearing process, some kind of decision there that is not a management decision to determine if fraud has occurred. That is really good to know. For an auditor, for management, we're not making that determination, right? But it does say, hey, management, we're supposed to be assessing risk. We're supposed to be looking for things that could be fraud or waste or abuse. We might not be able to say definitively if it is or not, but we can assess risk. So that's important. It's also important then to understand, hey, if we're going to investigate or if we think there is risk of fraud or abuse or waste, what does the evidence need to look like? Who should be doing an investigation, right? We want to make sure that all of that documentation is handled appropriately so that that judicial body, the adjudicative body, will be able to make a good decision. Okay, so we've now defined waste, abuse, and fraud. The paragraph on waste and abuse does kind of tie together these three concepts. It says waste and abuse do not necessarily involve fraud, though fraudulent misrepresentations may be made to conceal such misconduct. So they're calling waste and abuse misconduct, and it's kind of fascinating to me that what feels like the lower end of a misconduct like waste, I mean, you shouldn't do it, but it's not as bad as fraud. But does it become fraud because of how you represent it? Just interesting to think about how these things, how it all plays together, and how things probably could spiral out of control pretty quickly, even though it might start as something that feels or is perceived as kind of small, which could be waste. It says the presence of waste and abuse may indicate potential fraud and an environment that is conducive to fraud. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to make sure it's not just about fraud, it's about waste and abuse as well, right? Those are things that, hey, they can start telling us that maybe there's risk here. Maybe there's something we need to look at or do so that we don't get to the point where there is fraud. It also says waste and abuse may also impact the achievement of defined objectives. And Green Book is pretty clear that objectives, especially in a government space, are those things that we are required to do. So our requirements in Utah code, in board rule, in your local policies and procedures, those are your objectives. And waste, abuse, and fraud can get in the way of those. So now that we've defined those terms, here's a question for you. And again, you're welcome to put things in chat if you want. The benefit of trying to answer these questions, though, is really for you individually or personally to just take a few seconds to think about this and think about how you can apply this in the work that you're doing. So the question is, based on those definitions, are you aware of any waste, abuse, or fraud at your LEA? And if you are, how did you handle it or how will you handle it? And maybe as you're thinking about that, so last week I had the opportunity to participate in an ethics training, and the presenter was asking several questions. He pulled several poll questions about, well, if this happened, what would you do? If that happened, what would you do? So, for example, if you found out someone stole $500, would you report it to anyone? Would you fire them? Would you like slap on the wrist? Would you do something different? Would you not care? Well, what if it was $10,000? Would your answer change? What if it was $500 every week for 2 months? Would your answer change in how you would handle that? As we start thinking about waste, abuse, and fraud, it's also good to think about our accountability culture that we have at our LEA. How would we handle this? Do we know? Is it like, hey, this is it. This is the standard. That's it. We know who we would report it to. We know how to report. That's something important to consider as well. Now, as we're thinking about waste, abuse, and fraud, and as I was looking, I did several searches on social media, used AI, like tell me about waste, abuse, and fraud in Utah's public education system. And as I read through some articles and looked at some of the comments to the articles, a question came to me, and it's this next one listed here. Does the public and does the media differentiate their perception of waste, abuse, and fraud? Again, you're welcome to put a yes, a no. If you have any other thoughts in the chat, you're welcome to include that. So here's a comment that I found in response to an article. This was back in February of 2025 regarding how a school district used their federal COVID funds. And the individual said, I get so tired of bad behavior being justified by saying it's not fraud. I'm pretty sure that's not what's bothering most people with the way they, and that's the school district, spend these funds. No, based on the legal definition of fraud, this was not fraud. However, just because you can doesn't mean you should. So maybe this takes us back to sometimes the perception in this space, whether it's waste, abuse, or fraud, it's really reflecting what people think about trust and integrity and how fragile it can be. It can be very easy to break. I was in a training on AI just yesterday, and the presenter in that training indicated trust is incredibly difficult to build in a government space. It's much easier in a commercial space to build trust, much more difficult in government. And I believe that's true. So we need to realize and recognize that integrity, trust, those very important principles, they're a little bit fragile. And so it's why we should all care about waste, abuse, fraud. and what's happening with taxpayer resources. All right, let's focus now on the public education system and get kind of specific in the space that we're working in. So inherent risk in public education is significant. Inherent risk, if you do just a general definition search, it'll tell you it's raw exposure. It's kind of just the natural level of risk that exists before you try and mitigate anything, before you put an internal control in place. It's just, hey, because this exists, risk exists. That's inherent risk. So I was brainstorming just a few things. Hey, what inherent risk exists in public education? And I came up with a few things. They're listed here. I'll mention them, but you're welcome to put in the chat. If there are other inherent risks that you're aware of in public education, please share with the group. So here's a few things I came up with. Again, this is not an extensive list, an exhaustive list, but one of the areas of inherent risk is that we deal with, we get to participate with, we get to teach children and youth, and these are considered vulnerable populations. So there's inherent risk there. There's also inherent risk because public education has an enormous budget. It's very large. Public education, as I was listing out other different things that there are a lot of, I thought of buildings. There are over 1,100 schools in the state of Utah. Now, some of those are online, but many of them are brick and mortar buildings. So we have a lot of buildings. We have a lot of programs and activities. Even if we just thought of extracurricular activities, there are so many. So many that exist in public education. It's a lot to keep track of. We have so many laws and regulations, of which I'm sure you're aware, thousands of pages. And it's not just public education laws and regulations. There's accounting laws and regulations, procurement laws and regulations. You might even get into occupational safety, food safety. There's so many regulations that we're required to be aware of, which means there's inherent risk because there's a lot of knowledge we're required to have. And then our systems. Think about our systems. Wow, there's so many. There's data systems and financial systems and probably food systems and special ed systems and sprinkler systems and school safety systems. There's so many different systems that we have, right? And some of them are old and some of them are new and some of them are transitioning. So there's a lot of systems, which mean there's a lot of inherent risk in public education. All right, so those are just a few of the big risks that we face in public education. Now, what about waste, abuse, and fraud factors? Now that we've kind of said, hey, here are some of the areas. Let's look at how waste, abuse, and fraud might apply. So I have a few different charts that we'll walk through. This first one, well, most of the charts come from the Legislative Fiscal Analyst, and I've tried to include the link so that you can go there, you can open them, see everything that's available. This chart that I'm showing right now shows the 2026 appropriations from the legislature. Let's see, yeah, 2026 appropriations. So this is the money that will be available for fiscal year 2027. And you can see $8.9 billion, right? We do have an enormous budget. It's spread between several different programs. You can see some of them listed here, but we said inherent risk, we have so many programs. And this doesn't even show all of our LEAs and schools and how the money is broken out between our LEAs and schools. But that's a lot of money. So what's a waste, abuse, and fraud factor? Well, one is opportunity. One is opportunity. Another factor is rationalization. So as you look at this chart and all the programs and the amount of money, what does the chart indicate about the opportunity to commit waste, abuse, or fraud in public education? Or how would people rationalize committing waste, abuse, or fraud in the public education system? Well, again, you're welcome to put information in the chat if you have some ideas. A couple of thoughts I had, right? 8.9 billion. Wow, how does one go about getting some of that money, right? There are definitely legitimate ways that individuals would go about getting money. There's the potential, right? Because we're talking about waste, abuse, fraud, for illegitimate ways to get money, ways that might be extravagant or careless or that show, hey, this is not what a prudent person would do. But it's a lot of money. So there's opportunity, is what we're saying. There's opportunity for people to maybe take advantage of the system or want to get some of this money. Maybe they're thinking like, oh, this is a really big program. That's kind of where I would focus if I was, trying to commit waste, abuse, or fraud. Or maybe you would focus on a small program thinking, well, it's so small, probably no one's really looking at it. They're focused on the big areas. So maybe a small program is a good opportunity to commit waste, abuse, or fraud. And then rationalization. What do you think about rationalization? It's a little bit similar, like there's so much money. Would anyone really miss it? Or, hey, I'm working 60-hour weeks. It's fine if my lunch is $25 instead of $12, right? That's not extravagant given the amount of time I'm putting in at work. Rationalization, is there rationalization that we might do because there's $8.9 billion? Interesting to think about. The next chart comes from the Compendium of Budget Information, the COBE, also prepared by our legislative fiscal analyst. And this chart shows the legislative, or I like to say the taxpayer investment in public education in the context of the rest of the state budget. So you can see public education is listed fourth, right? 8.9 billion. And these are listed kind of in order as you go around the circle, definitely not in order of who has the largest amount of money. But public education with 8.9 billion is the second category, second largest category in the state's budget. First is social services at 9.5 billion. So public education is up there. And if we go back to our waste, abuse, and fraud factors of opportunity and rationalization, what does this chart indicate about that? What might you think of? Um, might be a little bit similar to the prior chart. Wow, there's a lot of money. But maybe in this context, it's, hey, if I wanted to commit waste, abuse, or fraud, am I going to a big program like public education or social services because there's more opportunity there for me to be able to take advantage as opposed to going to something smaller, right? Transportation's only 4.3 billion, so maybe that's not as great an idea. Again, just interesting to think about what might it look like. The next graph, also coming from the COBE website, it's a growth index chart. And what it says about this graph, it says it's tracking the inflation adjusted per capita operating and capital budgets, including expendable revenue accounts and funds from all sources as indexed to the first year displayed. So essentially, it's saying here we have from 2017 up to 2027, and it's showing the growth of those operating and capital budgets. Well, hey, if you put a trend line on this, it's looking pretty good. I mean, I don't love the dip for 2027. That's not looking so fantastic, right? In the growth index. But let's consider a third factor of abuse and waste and fraud, and that's pressure. So what might this graph tell us about pressure? Well, what it's sort of telling me, if the budget's not growing or not growing as fast, does that mean there's not as much money available? And if there's not as much money available, what does my budget look like? Am I going to be able to keep my teachers happy? Am I going to be able to procure what I need for my building to make sure it's safe for the students that are coming? Anyway, you start to consider, oh, what about pressure? Might we think about with this? If you were paying attention during the legislative session, which I'm sure you were, we're all just on pins and needles about what they're going to do, where they're going to allocate money. But this last session was very interesting. At one point, they said to state executive agencies, I think the judicial system, as well as public education, they said, hey, you need to do a scenario where if you cut 5%, what does that look like? What would you cut? What would you move? What would you adjust? And there was a lot of pressure. There were some amazing conversations that were happening with policymakers. If you were watching board meetings or legislative meetings, um, like what's happening here with the budget? There was so much pressure about what does it mean if I vote, for one program over another program? Does it mean I don't love the arts? Does it mean I don't think transportation is important, how we get our kids to school? So a lot of pressure tied up with what does funding look like in public education, but also in other areas in the state. So, in addition to money, though, what are other areas where policymakers or school board members or yourself as an administrator, a business administrator, a manager, an educator, a taxpayer, where are other places in public education where we might feel pressure to do something? Well, again, I kind of went out and did some research. I was like, hey, AI, Google, whatever, search on the internet. Tell me what's been going on in public education over the last month. So on the next couple of pages, there are some headlines that will maybe show some areas where, hey, there's pressure associated with this, which might impact a behavior or an act or a representation that you might need to make or your board needs to make. So here's some of the headlines that I found. I did try and include the date so that you'd see like, hey, most of these are very current. They were during this month, May 2026. Now, this first one, I just talked about it. What happened at the legislative session? The state board has to cut millions of dollars, right? And this was in January. So that's a real pressure. But what about just recently a data breach? There's a data breach. What does this mean? Oh my goodness. We have so many systems, so much data. What do I need to do? What do I need to communicate? When should I communicate it? Right? What representations are we making? Right? Go back to that definition of abuse or of willful misrepresentation. How did we handle all of that when we knew what was going on? Another one, here's the tough budget decisions again. This is May, but enrollment. Is enrollment increasing, decreasing? This is a really big deal for charter schools, right? What's happening with enrollment? What's happening in this state here with enrollment? Enrollment tags to funding, right? You get funding based on enrollment. That's really important. So is there pressure about enrolling? What's happening there? There was an article in May about how we're spending money, food, movies, travel, luxury blankets. Out of the gate, this really looks like, oh, is this careless? Was this extravagant? Is this waste? Was there more to it than that? Maybe it was a very legitimate incentive award, right? Just different things to think about. If are we rationalizing our teachers work hard, they should have a luxury blanket. Maybe they should. I'm not casting judgment, right? Wasn't making the decision on spending, but what is the perception? And based on the perception, is that impacting policymakers specific to funding, specific to those decisions they're making? The next one about a legal fight. This has to do with procurement. Sometimes there's pressure there. There can be timelines that must be met. We've got AI. Oh, what's happening with AI? Is there pressure there? Do more, do more. No, do less, do less. What's the role of AI? And how does that impact if there's waste, abuse, or fraud? School closures. This one was really interesting. I have family that lives in Provo and they were looking at closing 4 schools and then all of a sudden, no, there's no longer danger of closing schools. Just makes me want to ask some questions like what happened? Is enrollment not declining anymore? If enrollment still is declining, how are you managing to keep these schools open? Maybe there's a donation or something. What pressure is there or what pressure was there that led to, hey, a different decision was made and was it represented accurately? Student behavior, that's huge. We see this on the public education hotline all the time. Um, and maybe you'll enjoy this one. The USB Finance Committee at its last meeting, so earlier in the month of May, they were talking about LEA audit findings. The top state compliance audit findings listed were budgetary compliance, cash management, if you were properly insured. Then there are government auditing standards. An audit finding there was internal controls over financial reporting. And then single audit also had a similar finding, as well as internal controls over major federal programs. We talked about inherent risk, right? There's so many different things going on. There's so many things to keep track of. How do we do it and do it in such a way that we don't there's not waste, abuse, and fraud. So let's look at some elements, right? It's like, okay, this is where we're at. We know there's risk out there. How does it come about? So this is back to those anti-fraud resources that are available out on the GAO website. And it talks about activities, different frauds that could happen. One of the things that I thought was really interesting on this page is that it says activities, fraud, waste, abuse activities can be financial and non-financial. So here's an interesting financial, I don't know if I'll say fraud, maybe abuse, maybe waste. It's still playing out. But I recently saw, I get articles on audit reports from the different states, which, yes, I'm an audit nerd. I love reading audit reports. There was one from Louisiana talking about a school district that had 77 findings for fiscal year 2025 from their CPA firm. 77 findings, that's a lot. And four of those were disclaimers of opinion, including on their financial statements, essentially saying, like, it's so bad, we can't even give you an opinion. Well, what was interesting is that I looked at the financial statements, the ACFR for this school district, and what did I see reflected there? It as part of their ACFR? Well, this school district received the Certificate of Achievement from, let's see, I want to say it right. You probably all know it better than me. I got to get on the right page. Okay, the Certificate of Achievement for Excellence in Financial Reporting from GFOA and from the Association of School Business Officials. So the way that they reported their financial statements, the format was apparently excellent. But they had 77 findings, and their CPA firm said they actually couldn't give an opinion because it's so bad. Well, that's a form of financial, potentially fraud, abuse, right? The misrepresentations that they were making. I think someone was indicted for a felony. So interesting to think about when you're thinking financial. It might not be just dollars. It could be how you're reporting the financial information that is also incredibly important. Then it talks about those non-financial activities. We'll run through some of these really quick. It talks about trying to achieve prestige. What does waste, abuse, and fraud look like when you're trying to achieve prestige? Is there something that you would do? Is there pressure to be a top 10 charter school, to receive a certain award? Is there pressure to do that, right? Trying to get prestige. It talks about circumventing regulations and rules, right? Or overriding internal controls. It gives the specific example. It says educational institutions at all levels, so that includes us, may inflate grades to show adherence to standardization goals. Grade inflation, that's definitely something that I've seen a lot of articles about, and it's something that's being talked about. How is it impacting public education? Is there pressure that grades need to be a certain thing, right? Is a teacher feeling pressure, like all my kids need to get A's, they all need to be reading proficiently if I'm going to get a bonus? What does that look like? Couple other things, right? Compliance with environmental or workplace safety rules. There's a lot in Utah code coming out of our school safety task force that needs to happen in that space. Is there opportunity to take advantage of, right? And I think we saw a headline, right? There's a legal battle about those wearable panic devices. What's happening there? Was there any waste, abuse, or fraud happening with that? And then falsifying documents, also something to be aware of. We have a lot of data. We have a lot of documents. Is there ever, could you rationalize, well, if I didn't fill out this document right, I was trying to think of some documents, there's the assurance checklist. How do you fill out that assurance checklist that's required, I think, every year that the state board puts out? What about the fraud risk assessment that the Office of the State Auditor puts out? Interesting to think about. Are we falsifying anything? Like where I put my check, am I representing that accurately? Or am I willfully misrepresenting? And that's a type of fraud. So, specific to your LEA, what types of financial and non-financial, wasteful, abusive, or fraudulent behaviors and actions could occur? And have you discussed this with your LEA governing board? Something to think about. I tried to come up with some ideas like, okay, if I was going to have this discussion with my board or if I was trying to brainstorm this, what are some things that I could do? I came up with just a few areas. I'm sure you could think of other areas as well. So here's just a couple of suggestions, right? You could go to your federal, state, local programs, and document your allowable costs and activities. And just in looking at, hey, what's allowable? Are marketing costs allowable? You could consider, okay, how could waste, abuse, or fraud occur when you're looking at allowable activities or costs? Another thing you could do is looking at your financial statements or your budget and by line item, consider, can waste, abuse, or fraud occur? And some examples of this, right? If you're looking at your compensation line items, so salaries and benefits, is there any time inflation that could be happening? Think about your contracts with staff, with your educators. Is everyone coming on time? Do they stay the full amount of time that they're supposed to stay? Is anyone waiving that requirement in contract? So individuals are getting paid for time when they're not actually there, that they're required to be there. What about procurement? And P cards are a big place where there could be abuse. Travel expenses. Are reimbursements requests, are they being inflated? Are they being duplicated potentially? Um, as I thought about this one, I also thought about, hey, your third-party providers. And I think we had an example just recently, right, where third-party providers, we use them, they provide a phenomenal service for us, but we also need to consider what their internal control structure looks like. Can waste, abuse, or fraud happen? And with our third-party service providers, something to think about. And then the last one is, hey, if you walk through your different processes, financial, non-financial, and create operational flow charts, you can really see, do I have a separation of duties issue? Someone that has too many duties, nobody's checking on them, there's no accountability. What does that look like? Or you could identify inefficient or ineffective processes, which is waste, right? Waste could be happening there. And if you're looking at this and thinking, there is not a chance that I have time to do any of these things, which is fair, we're all busy. I have thought recently, we are a state that has some phenomenal universities and colleges. And I know there are classes and courses at our higher institutions of higher education where they really want their students to be able to have opportunities to go out and solve problems, real world problems, real life problems, or be able to give back or help in some way. Maybe this is a place, if you were to reach out to a college or university near you, they have a few students, they have a class that would love the opportunity to come in and take a look at something for you, right? Maybe it's just flowcharting one process. Maybe it's 10. Maybe it is looking at your financial statements. I think there's resources out there that are available to us that don't cost all the money in the world that would maybe help us out and give us additional resources. So that's maybe just something to think about. All right, rolling on. Who commits waste, abuse, and fraud? Well, going back to our anti-fraud resources, right? It could happen externally. It could happen internally. There could be a combination of both. One of the things I thought interesting on this screen was that it says the fraudster may attack from within or outside. And I don't know that I ever necessarily thought of waste, abuse, or fraud as an attack. That seemed like, wow, that's a very strong word. But but maybe they're attacking our taxpayer resources. They're attacking our integrity and our trust. And so it really is a big deal. It is a big deal. So specific to your LEA, maybe think about when you're considering, okay, we have financial areas, non-financial areas, who in those areas, internally and externally, could commit waste, abuse, or fraud. And when you're thinking about external, think about those third parties, think about volunteers, maybe, think about associations. And when I say associations, here's an example for you. My mom was an elementary school secretary for many years. And every year, the PTA at the school would throw an extravaganza so that they could fundraise for money. It's great. This is fantastic. My family loved to go. We would participate. We liked the cakewalk, right? All of that. It was a great activity. But I did one year, I couldn't help myself. And my mom was in the school office and she was helping, right? They'd helped with the punch passes, the tickets, and making sure did a hole punch and they'd put a string around it so kids could wear it around their neck. And she was helping count money. And I asked my mom, I said, Mom, are you volunteering to help the PTA with this activity? Or is this part of what you're getting paid for? Like this is a taxpayer funded activity that you're helping out here. Which is it? Right? Like, did the PTA provide the paper for the punch tickets? They use the copier. Anyway, just things to ask, right? It's like the PTA is separate from the school. Should they be using the copier? Should they be using, the elementary school secretary to help with some things? Or my mom assured me she was volunteering, right? It was not waste, abuse, or fraud or anything. But it was just interesting to think about, right? Interesting to think about. Okay, so wrapping it up, our last section is about how do we reasonably combat abuse, waste, fraud? What can we do? And I really think the answer is simple. It's simple. It is not easy, but it is simple. And before I tell you what the answer is, I will tell you a question, just something to think about as we've talked about integrity and trust, and we'll talk about core values. But I was asked a question in a training that I participated in last week. The individual is John Hall. Maybe some of you have participated in his trainings, but he said, why do intelligent business and government leaders stare right into the face of ethics and then do the wrong thing anyway? Well, so how do we, again, reasonably combat that, right? It needs to be material. There is no way we are going to 100% bulletproof our LEAs and the processes that we have and all of that. So how can we reasonably do it? And I'm 100% convinced at this point in my life that it is all about internal control systems. That's the answer. So internal control systems, there are 5 components. The first is you need to know your objectives. What are you trying to do? And what is the structure to achieve that? How can you do it? What positions do you need? What's the reporting structure? What does accountability look like? What tone is established by your board and then by administration? All of that is the first component. The second component is saying, now, what's going to get in the way? What's a barrier? What's going to be a problem? The third component is then, okay, I'm looking at those barriers and I'm going to come up with a way to mitigate the barrier, to try and take care of it, to try and lower the problem, reduce the problem. The fourth thing is communication. You have to make sure everybody at your entity, your LEA, your agency, everyone knows. Everyone knows what's going on, what you're trying to accomplish, why you're doing the things that you're doing. Everyone has to know. And there needs to be data that's going to help you understand, like, well, did it work? Did we do it right? Are we doing what we wanted to do? Right? You need data. You need good performance data. And then the last component, the last step is just saying, did 1 through 4 work? Did it all work? Everything that we did? And that's why I say it's simple, because it's easy for me in 1 minute or less, right, to say, here's the 5 things to do. It's much more difficult to take this and try and implement it. It's difficult. It's simple, but it's difficult. But we are required actually to have internal control systems. Federal regulations require it, R277113 requires it, and it says we're supposed to base our internal control systems on the guidance in the Green Book or COSO, right? Those are the two big internal control system frameworks. The Green Book was just updated. It's 131 pages. Again, I highly recommend that you read it. And so I do have the question, when was the last time you read it? The Green Book or COSO, whichever one you want. And when was the last time your governing board had a discussion on internal control systems? Interesting to think about. Okay, my last couple points, culture and core values. I really like the statement, culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's sometimes attributed to Peter Drucker. I've also heard that it's not actually attributed to him. It might just be out there and it's said quite frequently, but culture eats strategy for breakfast. If that's true, you might be able to come back and say, well, why would you even focus on internal control systems if culture is where it's all at? Well, I think it's a little bit of a misnomer because internal control systems include culture and core values. Culture and core values are included in the control environment, which is that very first component, right? When you're establishing, this is what I'm trying to do, this is how I'm going to try and do it, here's the positions, here's the accountability. That's when you're establishing culture and core values. That's when it's happening. So if you're establishing a good control environment, then those other components should follow. So I almost think, okay, instead of culture eats strategy for breakfast, is it the control environment will eat those other four components for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It's really hard to say, I'm going to take care of the barriers that there are and put in control activities if you haven't established what you're trying to do and who's going to do it and how you will hold them accountable. It gets a little tricky. So something to keep in mind. I absolutely think culture and core values are very, very important. I've seen the benefits of that, of implementing them, of making sure, hey, we're all on the same page with culture and core values can have quite an effect, an amazing effect on your departments, on your agency, on your LEA. So maybe think, what are the core values of your LEA? Have they been intentionally established? Do you know what they are? If not, that's a great conversation to have with your administration and with your governing board. And then you use it when you hire people, you use it when you do performance management. Like, we're looking for people that have these kinds of values. For example, my internal audit department, our 5 core values are efficiency, excellence, life balance, professionalism, and integrity. That's what I'm looking for whenever I interview someone to come look at a position that I might have open. But look at your core values. Core values and culture will exist whether or not you're intentional about it or not. If you're not intentional, then I hope you get lucky, but it can really cause problems if you don't have a strong culture and core values. And also, what does accountability look like in your organization? It's something that you need to take seriously. And all of these are part of the control environment, part of your internal control system framework. And I have this picture at the bottom. Internal controls changed my life. My department did an audit of internal controls back in 2020, and that's when I really came to believe that internal control systems are the answer. It's if you learn how to speak that language, if you learn what it's about, internal control systems will not just help you prevent fraud, waste, and abuse. It will help you achieve your objectives, the things that you really want to do. It will help make sure our educators are able to teach and do what they really want to do. It will help make sure that our students are safe and successful. It will help you in the financial realm, right? Making sure, hey, our contracts are looking good, the money is all where it's supposed to be, right? It's all this protection that it provides when we have an internal control system. So that's pretty much the presentation that I have for you. Thank you again for the opportunity to come present. I'm happy to take questions anytime. You're welcome to reach out and contact me or my staff anytime. If we can help you, we would love to help. So thank you, Lisa, for this opportunity, and I appreciate your time today.
Sorry, my mouse was not cooperating as I wanted it to. Thank you so much, Debbie, for being here. I really appreciate it. Um, don't see any questions in the chat, so thank you, and I will make sure that we will get this recording out to everyone as well as the materials that Debbie mentioned, and we hope to see you again because we enjoyed that.
Thank you so much. See you
Thanks,
all later.
Debbie. All right, everybody, like I said, that is our last meeting for this school year. We will resume again in August. I would love it if you would give me any ideas for what you would like some topics to be for next year. That would be very helpful. If not, as usual, I will figure something out and we will go from there. Thank you so much for being here today, and we will see you next time. Have a good evening, afternoon and evening. Thanks.